Welcome to the Global Current, where Seton Hall's diplomacy students give you a fresh look on what's going on in the world. I'm James Janos. In this week's news, Ireland's former crime lord and drug baron John Gilligan is released from prison. In Geneva, Iran continues nuclear talks with other world leaders. And the former president of Liberia, Charles Gankay Taylor, has been allowed to serve the remainder of his jail sentence for war crimes in the United Kingdom. And in analysis, the failed attempt to fix the presidential elections in Azerbaijan, and Egypt's transformation to a democracy and the possibilities of a full-fledged democracy. And we'd like to thank you for tuning in and hope you enjoy the show. And now, executive producer Laura Toledo fills us in on one of Ireland's top crime bosses.
The man who has been called Ireland's most dangerous criminal was released from prison this Tuesday after serving 17 years of a 20-year sentence. Crime lord and drug baron John Gilligan, 61, served 17 years in prison after being convicted of possession with the intent to distribute almost 45,000 pounds of cannabis. Although originally eligible for release in 2011, Gilligan was handed an additional 2-year sentence after he was found guilty of assaulting a prison officer. Gilligan was also caught twice illegally using a mobile phone in prison, further adding to his sentence. John Gilligan was originally detained on the suspicion of his involvement in the murder of Veronica Guerin, one of Ireland's most well-known crime reporters. At the time of her death, Guerin had been investigating Gilligan's various criminal enterprises, particularly the influx of heroin into the country in the 1990s. Upon his release, Gilligan's family welcomed him at their home in Clondalkin, County Dublin, with a festive celebration. While the Gilligan clan celebrated, Veronica Guerin's brother Jimmy told Britain's The Guardian that he would not be surprised if Gilligan returned to his life of crime. He said, quote, "He was always a criminal and thug and will go to his grave as a criminal and thug." Veronica Guerin began investigating Gilligan's ties to Ireland's drug trade for the Sunday Independent in 1995. Guerin was able to tap into a broad network of underworld sources by accurately reporting information without breaking Ireland's libel laws, which make it illegal to name suspected criminals. On one occasion, after questioning Gilligan about the source of income that supported his lavish lifestyle, she was violently assaulted by him. Before Gilligan could be brought to trial for this beating, Guerin was murdered on June 26, 1996. 2 men on a motorcycle shot Guerin 6 times while she was stopped at a red light on a road near the town of Clondalkin, County Dublin. Though Gilligan was at the top of a list of suspects wanted in connection with her murder and charges were brought against him, he was ultimately acquitted. However, 2 of Gilligan's top lieutenants, Brian Meehan and Patrick Holland, were tried for the slaying. Meehan was alleged to have driven the motorcycle while Holland is widely thought to have fired the fatal shots. Meehan was found guilty of attempted murder, but prosecutors could not secure the evidence needed to convict Holland of murder, and he was acquitted. He was later found guilty of possession of cannabis for sale or supply and died of natural causes while serving his sentence in 2009. The criminal underworld's involvement in Guerin's high-profile killing spurred Ireland to create the Criminal Assets Bureau, or CAB. Formed just months after Guerin's murder, the CAB was given the power to seize the assets of suspected criminals. The CAB was founded on the multi-agency concept, bringing together specialists from various fields to work together in the pursuit of serious criminals and their assets. Rob Wainwright, the current director of Europol, singled out the CAB as a role model for the rest of Europe, and has since introduced a similar model for criminal asset recovery within Europol, the European Union's chief law enforcement agency. Back in Ireland, John Gilligan has been pushing back against the CAB. He lodged a new complaint in Ireland's High Court over the legality of the sale of his estate called Jessbrook in Leinster. Jessbrook was seized by the CAB shortly after Gilligan was sent to prison in 2001. Current CAB chief Eugene Corcoran told the Irish Times that Gilligan's latest challenge has no legal basis and his attempts to frustrate the sale will have no effect. Aside from proceeding with the sale of Gilligan's seized assets, the CAB does not currently have plans to continue to monitor John Gilligan, leaving Ireland's most dangerous criminal free to go about his business. This is Laura Toledo for the Global Current.
Staffer Dina El Sayed tells us about the resumed nuclear talks with Iran in Geneva.
Geneva, on Tuesday, October 15, Iran and 6 world powers resumed nuclear talks. The negotiations in Geneva brought together Iran officials with representatives of P5+1, the permanent members of UN Security Council, Britain, China, France, Russia, and the US, plus Germany. The talks on Tuesday started on an optimistic note with the Iranian delegation presented a proposal entitled Closing Unnecessary Crisis, Opening Up New Horizons. Iran's nuclear program dates back to 1950s. The state has always insisted on its intended use for civilian. When a past attempt at negotiation failed, the Security Council unanimously approved sanctions in December 2006, aiming to curb Iran's nuclear program. These sanctions banned the import and export of material and technology used in uranium enrichment and reprocessing and in the production of ballistic missiles. A particularly severe sanction was the European Union embargo on Iranian oil, put into place on July 1, 2012. This embargo placed severe restriction on Iran's ability to sell its most important export. In addition, the U.S. imposed sanctions on parties aiding Iran's nuclear program this past May. During the first 2 days of reinvigorated negotiations, Iran appears ready to scale back activity of potential use in making nuclear bombs, suggesting it is willing to compromise for a deal to win relief from harsh economic sanctions. Iran Foreign Minister Javad Zarif indicated that they expect to reach an agreement within a year. The parties agreed the follow-up talks will be held on November 7th and 8th. The Iranian proposal remained confidential, though EU officials announced that it includes 3 stages: defining an end state for nuclear program, taking measures to contain facets of nuclear program, and lifting off sanctions by larger international community. The last step would be an announced visit by International Atomic Energy Agency. Multiple officials highlighted the progress after 2 days of the talk between the 6 world powers and Iran on its nuclear development program. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif and the EU Official Policy Chief Catherine Ashton issued a joint statement.
Having the Foreign Minister of Iran come and openly talk was of itself a change in the dynamic. All ministers engaged with that, all had an opportunity to put their points of view, and the atmosphere was a very positive one.
The next round of talks is scheduled to begin on November 7. However, nuclear scientists and sanction experts from the P5+1 and Iran agreed to meet prior to the date. Although there was no concrete breakthrough and the parties are far from achieving agreement on what the end state of Iran's nuclear program will look like, a sense of hopeful optimism has begun to develop among all involved. Dina El Sayed for the GlobalCurrent.
And rounding out the news, Etayo Akanji updates us on the former convicted president of Liberia, who has been sent to the United Kingdom to serve out the remainder of his jail sentence for war crimes.
The convicted former president of Liberia, Mr. Charles Gankay Taylor, has been transferred from the Netherlands to the United Kingdom to serve the remainder of his 50 years prison sentence. In a press release from the Special Court for Sierra Leone on October 10th, they affirmed the transfer was authorized by the President of the Special Court on October 4, 2013, pursuant to Rule 22 of the Special Court of Sierra Leone Statute and Rule 103B of the Rules of Procedure and Evidence. The Special Court President's order was in accordance with an earlier agreement on enforcement of the sentence reached in July 2007 between the courts and the UK. Mr. Taylor was transferred from the Netherlands at about 8:54 a.m. GMT on a chartered plane under a heavy security detail and was received by Her Majesty's prison officials at the UK at 10 a.m. GMT. At one time, Taylor had asked to be transferred to Rwanda to serve out the remainder of his sentence, arguing it would make it easier for his family and friends to visit him. He also feared he may be the target of prison attacks in the UK. The former Liberian president was in exile in Nigeria until he was arrested on March 29, 2006 by Nigerian authorities while trying to escape the country. He was transferred to The Hague that same day. He was convicted by the trial chamber of the Special Court of Sierra Leone on 11 counts of war crimes against humanity and other serious violations of international humanitarian law on 26 April 2012 and was sentenced to 50 years in prison the following month. Mr. Taylor appealed both his conviction and sentence to the appeal chamber of the Special Court, but last month on September 26th, the appeal court upheld his conviction and sentence as delivered by the trial court. The Special Court of Sierra Leone was established by both the government of Sierra Leone and the United Nations to investigate and prosecute those persons who bear the greatest responsibility for serious violations of international humanitarian law and Sierra Leonean law for offenses committed in the territory of Sierra Leone starting on November 30, 1996, when the Civil War began. Taylor was president of the neighboring states of Liberia and was accused of arming Sierra Leonean rebels in exchange for the country's blood diamonds mined using slave labor. The Civil War claimed about 120,000 lives from 1991 to 2002 and represents one of the first instances of the mass use of child soldiers in civil wars in Africa. The lead prosecutor in the Charles Taylor case, Brenda Hollis, noted that Mr. Taylor is the first former head of state to be convicted by an international criminal tribunal since the Nuremberg trials of Nazi leaders in 1946. While it is unlikely that 65-year-old Taylor will ever step out of the prison alive, he will be given credit for time already served in detention since his arrest on 26th of March 2006. Taylor was born on January 28, 1948 in Liberia. He graduated with an associate degree in accounting in 1974 from Chamberlain Junior College in Boston, Massachusetts, and with a Bachelor of Science degree in economics 1976 from Bentley College in Waltham, Massachusetts. In 1986, he formed an armed group, the National Patriotic Front for Liberia, NPLF, in opposition to President Samuel Doe of Liberia. In 1989, he led his forces into Liberia and remained the leader of the NPFL throughout the Liberian Civil War. Taylor was elected president of Liberia on 2nd August 1997. It has been Eitayo Akanji for the GlobalCurrent.
And in analysis this week, staffer Amanda Noon looks at the flawed elections in Azerbaijan.
This past week, Azerbaijan held a general presidential election. Incumbent President Ilham Aliyev was re-elected by an alleged 86% gain of the overall vote, despite having 9 opponents for the seat. Several human rights groups have declared the election and its results to be illegitimate. This is not only due to the overwhelming result that President Aliyev received in the election, but there have been several reports on voting and overall election fraud. During the campaign, not much media attention was focused on the opposition candidates, with the exception of one televised debate that the president did not participate in. Before Election Day, a florist in the capital city of Baku told EurasiaNet.org that the government had already prepaid for flowers for Aliyev's inauguration. The day before the election, the first scandal relating to the election broke out as an app created by the Central Election Commission reported that President Aliyev had won with 70% of the vote. On Election Day itself, there had been several reports of tampering with ballots. In one such case, public employees were discouraged from voting for other candidates in order to avoid repercussions.
Many public sector workers were given ballot papers that had already been filled in. They were told to cast those, then bring back the clean ballots to keep their jobs.
In another case, a school teacher stated that they were required by their boss to vote in several polling stations. Literal ballot stuffing was also a problem nationwide, as a video posted by the OSCE revealed a man in the western province of Shamkir openly stuffing 50 ballots into a ballot box at the polling station. As a result, groups such as Amnesty International and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, also known as the OSCE, have called the elections illegitimate, with the OSCE stating that the election was undermined by limitations on the freedom of expression, assembly, and association that did not guarantee a level playing field for candidates. The campaign and election results are nothing new for the Azeri people. This will be President Aliyev's third term as president, a role that he inherited after his father, President Haydar Aliyev, passed away in 2003. Haydar Aliyev had begun his term as president shortly after the country gained independence from the Soviet Union. During the USSR days, Haydar was the leader of Soviet Azerbaijan, with a term that extended from the late 1960s to the early 1980s. One of the main topics of the campaign and Aliyev's re-election is his work in promoting Azerbaijan. Nestled between Russia, Turkey, and Iran, Azerbaijan is noted to have a strategic role in the region. As a result, the state, with the help of the president, has started to focus on promoting itself to Western nations. This is primarily funded by the state's petroleum production, which not only accounts for 80% of the country's GDP, but it also accounts for 92% of the state's exports. Because the Aliyev family has had an authoritative role in the country, most of the $15 billion in profits from oil reserves go to the president and his family. These profits tend to go towards the military budget, but the petrodollars have also been used for President Aliyev's continuing campaign to promote Azerbaijan on an international level. As a result, millions of dollars have been spent on luxury but not economically sufficient building projects such as convention centers, hotels, and the world's largest flagstaff. The Azeri government has also used construction projects to promote itself to the international community in an effort to obtain the right to host international conferences and competitions. The results have been mixed, as it hosted the Eurovision Song Contest in 2012 but had an unsuccessful bid in hosting the 2020 Summer Olympics. During the construction of several of these projects, human rights organizations have criticized the Azeri government for forcefully evicting people out of their home and not providing adequate compensation for lost property. Despite committing several human rights violations, President Aliyev is said to remain popular among the Azeri public for his work in rebuilding Baku and promoting the country. However, with a crackdown on protests and the use of public humiliation to subvert those who criticize the government as norms in Azeri society, the Aliyev administration continues to be seen as an oppressive one. As the country has become more recognized worldwide, more attention will be brought on President Aliyev's questionable election results and human rights violations. However, because of its vast oil resources and strategic location, it remains to be seen whether pressure put on the Aliyev administration will improve the condition of the country. This has been Amanda Noon for the GlobalCurrent.
And rounding out analysis, staffer Adam Bergdorf analyzes the political landscape in Egypt and the prospects for a complete transformation to democracy.
Recently, President Barack Obama announced that the United States would be suspending some of the military aid promised to Egypt due to the continued military and political unrest. This act drew criticism from both the domestic left and right, as they see this suspension as a move of endorsement of ousted President Morsi and his Muslim Brotherhood-backed political party. However, this move was meant to convey a very different message. It was not meant to lend support to Morsi or any other political faction. In fact, the actual effect of the cut in monetary terms is negligible. Instead, the message is heavy with symbolic pressure. It is meant to call attention to the contestable legitimacy of the military coup that ousted the Muslim Brotherhood from power. No matter how unsavory one might have found the Muslim Brotherhood's tenure in Egypt's politics, the military takeover of government was a serious misstep in Egypt's road to democratization. The coup effectively delivered a double strike against the process, undermining the very foundation of a democratic rule by circumventing the ballot box and by driving the Muslim Brotherhood out of the political arena and back into the fringes of society. The military takeover of the government severely damaged faith in the democratic process. After the January 2011 revolution that ousted longtime President Mubarak, the Muslim Brotherhood swept into power in both the parliamentary and presidential elections. But this strong showing at the polls was not due to any ideological or political connection with the majority of the voters. Instead, it had to do with the high degree of organization the Muslim Brotherhood was able to maintain under the Mubarak regime. Essentially, the Muslim Brotherhood had an entire political apparatus at the ready, as they had already been fielding candidates under the Mubarak-sanctioned pseudo-opposition party of Independence. The Muslim Brotherhood simply needed an opening through which to launch their full-scale political operations. The revolution provided the key moment. In fact, although the Muslim Brotherhood secured victory during the presidential election, they could hardly claim any sort of electoral mandate. During the general election, Morsi received just over 5 million votes, securing top position leading into the runoff. However, the second closest candidate, military-sponsored Ahmed Shafiq, also received close to 5 million votes. Meanwhile, revolutionary political candidates received the vast majority of the votes, at around 11 million. But because this huge voting bloc was split among dozens of candidates, none of them made it to the final runoff ballot. The revolutionary parties, had they had the strong organization and political consolidation in place, could have had an exceptional showing in the elections. Given the time to establish themselves and create larger coalitions among the myriad of parties, they also could have made a very strong opposition once Morsi's 4-year term had come to an end. Politician and friend of former President Morsi, Dr. Azam Tamimi, admitted in a Sky News interview that, towards the end of his term, Morsi had lost the public support, but asserted a coup was absolutely the wrong course of action for the country.
Since he took office, President Morsi could not do much in the country because the police was against him, the army was against him, the judges who were appointed by Hosni Mubarak were against him, and they thwarted every attempt on his part to reform the system.
He also added, quote, "The only credible expressions of public will is the ballot box. In any human society, when people have political disputes, you ought to resolve these disputes in a civilized manner by going to the ballot box and accept what the ballot box returns." A similar case can be seen just across the Mediterranean, as Greece is currently seeing a rising backlash against the Golden Dawn Party, an extreme right political group that swept into a leading position during the height of the Greek debt crisis. Currently, several party leaders and members have been arrested for various crimes, including an alleged party conspiracy to carry out the murder of a musician activist who was highly critical of the party. It is likely that these party members will be removed from power when their convictions come through. However, the Greek government has not made any steps to outlaw the Golden Dawn Party and have made these criminal proceedings as transparent as possible in order to clarify that these are criminal charges, not political ones. If the Egyptian military felt Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood were violating laws, there were systems in place that they could have used instead of forcing Morsi out by gunpoint. The coup in Egypt has also taken its toll on the prospects of Egypt finding its own appropriate balance between its Islamic values and democratic politics. When the Muslim Brotherhood won such a strong position in the post-Mubarak government, many in the political world were pleased with the result, not because they supported the beliefs of the Muslim Brotherhood, but because they disagreed with them. Engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood in a political arena would force an open dialogue on the value system they intended to base their legislative strategy around. Author and activist Araf Souif, in a BBC interview earlier this month, expressed her frustration over the July coup. Although she herself had voted for Morsi, she admitted she was glad he was no longer in power. Yet, she also expressed displeasure at how he was removed.
Is that there is a quarrel, there is an argument between the forces of political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood on the one hand, and the other forces on the other, let's call them whatever, progressive, liberal, non-religious based. And that argument was impossible to have.
As well, party members would be forced to justify their stances, not theologically, but politically, and hold them against the tangible rubric of Egypt's new constitution. Take, for example, the hardline stance on barring women's participation in government that some in the Muslim Brotherhood took. Attempting to reconcile excluding a large portion of the populace from the electorate simply could not be reconciled with the constitution, and this inability to reconcile their ideas began to push the Muslim Brotherhood towards the center. In fact, this process was already underway before the July coup, despite the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood declaring that the Freedom and Justice Party was to be the only party Muslim Brotherhood members could run under and vote for. Many younger members broke off and formed their own alternative political parties to challenge the Muslim Brotherhood's stances on social issues. Politician Abdul Monem, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, was one such person. Taking cues from the success of Turkey's AKP party at blending basic Islamic beliefs and democratic processes, he founded his own Egyptian version of the party. There was also significant pushback against the old guard leadership in the Freedom and Justice Party about their secretive nature and closed, opaque style of decision-making. The military government has taken the opposite approach of political engagement and dialogue with the Muslim Brotherhood, and just last month, an Egyptian court ruled to ban all party activities and place all assets and the social organization under government control. This action will only serve to drive the Muslim Brotherhood back onto itself and out of the mainstream Egyptian society. Now, instead of fragmenting and liberalizing their stances, they are likely to harden their convictions, re-solidify their organization, and double down on their extreme rhetoric and violence. So, what can Egypt do in order to get back on its path to democracy? The absolute first step is to put a stop to the ban on Muslim Brotherhood political activities. Re-engagement is critical at this stage. Egypt cannot afford to revert back to the Mubarak era of outlawed political parties, as it completely negates everything the revolution stood for. Egypt must also create stronger institutional capabilities for other political parties. Egypt should institute a policy for the next election that levels the playing field for parties that do not have such an extensive support network already in place. This could be done through a system of campaign finance limits or public funding of the campaigns with strict rules of actions. Finally, Egypt must restore faith in the democratic process. It is necessary to take steps to demonstrate the validity of the removal of Morsi from power in a clear, transparent manner. If he and members of his party have committed crimes, charge them. If not, leave them be. They also need to give assurances that this was an extreme circumstance, that not every election the military finds unfavorable will result in a coup. Acting President Mansour must put in place strong judicial branch reforms that will allow a valid and legitimate removal of leaders if they lose the support of the people. Democracy in Egypt can survive and flourish. Unfortunately, it will take a large change of direction for current leadership. Hopefully, the upcoming spring elections in Egypt will signal the course change by allowing those elected to finish their terms for good or for bad. Adam Bergdorf, The Global Current.
In concluding this week's show, staffer Fadeshola Ochekari sits down with Seton Hall political science professor Ann Hewitt discussing how the United States healthcare system compares to the rest of the world's.
Hey everyone, we're here with Professor Hewitt from Seton Hall University, and she's going to be talking to us today about the current healthcare system in the United States and how it compares to other countries. Professor Hewitt, how are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine.
Okay, so I want to start off, simple question. Many people are talking about affordable healthcare and how the only reason why countries like Canada, Netherlands, Germany, or other European countries are able to afford healthcare is because they pay more taxes than the U.S. Do we really pay that little in taxes for our healthcare?
Well, let me start off by saying that no doubt we do spend more per person than any other country. But I think we have to put that in context of how much we actually do pay. And second of all, we have to look at that word that you used, taxes. Most countries operate on a system where they're like a company. In other words, they have a benefits package for their population. And when you say, are we paying more than others? Yes, but those other countries may be receiving other benefits that we do not give to our population. So it's a big pot versus a small pot. But there is no doubt that you are correct. Yes, we do spend more. Now, the next issue we have to address is what you said about taxes. How is our health care system funded, here in the U.S.? Well, we certainly have two big players, that is the Medicare and the Medicaid system. But those are paid, the individuals who receive funds from those, the health care providers, those are paid based on payment scales. So I think when you think about total amount of taxes, you also have to look at, is it really a tax, or is the government taking out of its general operating monies covering these services that have been mandated through law? The other thing that I want to talk about in your question is that idea of affordable. Affordability is a way of looking at how much, or the ability of a population to pay for a service. So my question might be, has the U.S. topped out? Are we at the point where the average person, the average American, can no longer afford health care? And we're casting around looking at other models, such as universal health care in Canada and the Netherlands, and saying, okay, they seem to have a better system than we have, although there are also pros and cons to both of those. So I think it's a supply and demand question. We have a wonderful supply of health care here in the U.S. The population demands that health care. And as you know, in any kind of economic equation, the more you do, the larger the supply, the greater the demand, the cost is going to go up.
Yeah, and and I'm glad you brought that up. I was reading an article in the New York Times this past August, and it was detailed about the phenomenon of people taking trips to their have surgeries done overseas, essentially medical tourism.
It's now being called destination medicine, and it really sounds intriguing. You kind of like the idea of, well, why do I have to spend this money when I can go somewhere else and get it? But what you have to realize is that you're paying for a package of health care when you do this destination medicine. It's very different than the way health care is delivered here, where you would have the additional follow-up. You would be able to go back if something unfortunate happened or you didn't have the outcome that you wanted.
Right. Well, thank you, Professor Hewitt. Really appreciate it.
Okay. It was nice to talk to you.
It's nice to talk to you, too. Take care.
Bye-bye.
And this is Fadeshola Ojekere from the Global Current.
and we'd like to thank you for tuning into this week's show. Please check us out at blogs.shu.edu/globalcurrent and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. This has been James Janos, and we'll see you next week.